Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar. My name is Elliot Wickham, and I am with NOAA's NITIS as the Southeast Drought Early Warning System Coordinator. Today's agenda, we have Chris Fuhrman with the climate overview, Shelby Saxon with the water resources overview. We have Pam Knox back with the agricultural impact update. And then our special topic is drought preparation, management, and recovery guides for the Southeast farmers from Michael Gavazzi with the USDA Southeast Climate Hub. Reminders, we'll be using the Slido app, which I'll show how to use that here in a moment. Please use that to put in any questions and comments you may have. So if you're using WebEx in the browser, to get to the Slido app, click on Apps, and then open the Slido there, type in your questions. And then if you're in the app, the WebEx app, please go to Slido, click on the app down there, and then use that to type in your questions. I will turn it over now to Chris Fuhrman to give the climate discussion.
All right, great. Thanks, Elliot. Good morning, everyone. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll start as we usually do with temperatures. And August, it's been another really warm month across much of the Southeast. As you can see from all the red, orange, and even some maroon there on the map, several locations are on track to record one of their 5 warmest Augusts on record. Many of these places are located across Florida, the Carolinas, and Virginia. Warmth has been especially notable across the peninsula of Florida. West Palm Beach, for example, is currently on pace for its warmest August on record. And if you look at places like Fort Myers, Miami, Melbourne, Sarasota, and even Orlando, they're among their 5 warmest to date. Speaking of Miami, they reached 100 degrees back on August the 18th. That's only the second time that's happened in the official record there, which goes back to 1895. But some historical observations that we've pulled up recently indicate that it might have occurred twice during the 1800s. We look a little further north. Raleigh, Durham, Wilmington, Charleston, Cape Hatteras, and Norfolk are also among their 5 warmest starts to August. And we continue to see exceptional warmth across the Caribbean. Juncos and A Bonito are currently having their warmest Augusts on record. They're on Puerto Rico, while San Juan, Arecibo, and St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands are all among their 3 warmest month to date. Okay, next slide. All right, turning to precipitation, the pattern has been more variable, right, as we would expect for this time of year. There are some very wet areas on the map, especially across the interior of the region, as well as parts of the Gulf Coast, also portions of northern Alabama, and also some localized areas along the Atlantic coast have been wet as well. Wilmington, North Carolina, for example, they're approaching 14 inches of rain for the month, while Charlottesville, Virginia, has received more than 10 inches. Cleveland, Tennessee, that's located near Chattanooga, they're having their second wettest start to August on record. So definitely some wet areas, but also some very dry areas, especially across parts of Alabama and Georgia, also parts of eastern North Carolina, and much of the Florida Peninsula, where rainfall totals so far this month have been below an inch. That's below the 5th percentile in many cases. So you look at places like Alma, Georgia, Danville, Tuscaloosa, Marathon Key, Beaufort, North Carolina, lots of places there running very dry. And of course, the U.S. Caribbean, they continue to be exceptionally dry. San Juan has received less than an inch of rain so far this month, putting it in the 2nd percentile, and that's on top of the extremely dry month they had in July. And rainfall deficits, if you look more broadly across the Caribbean, 2 to nearly 4 inches widespread. So very, very dry down there. Okay, next slide. All right, so with just about a week remaining in meteorological summer, we can also begin to put the season as a whole into perspective. And of course, one of the big stories continues to be the heat. Several locations, especially across Florida, a lot of the same places we just talked about, Florida, the Carolinas, Caribbean, all on track for one of their warmest summers on record. West Palm Beach, again, some that we've already mentioned, West Palm Beach, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, all on pace to have their warmest summer on record. Orlando, second warmest. And then if you look at places like Wilmington, Charleston, Fort Myers, Raleigh, Key West, Punta Gorda, it's like the list goes on, all among their 5 warmest summers to date. But again, the Caribbean, really want to emphasize the Caribbean here. That's really standing out. Juncos, Bonito, they're on pace for their warmest summers on record. Arecibo, St. Thomas, San Juan, all among their 5 warmest. So, barring any major change over the final week of the month, which I don't think is going to happen, this is really going to go down as an exceptionally warm summer certainly across the Caribbean, but also across many parts of the mainland Southeast as well. Okay, next slide. All right, looking at summer rainfall. Again, lots of variability as we would expect across the region. Some locations have been quite wet. If we look across parts of Tennessee, Alabama, they really stand out. And there's also some pockets of above average rainfall elsewhere. But if you look at the Atlantic coast, Florida Peninsula especially, they've been very, very dry. And some of the deficits are actually quite large. Miami, running 15 inches below normal for the summer. Fort Lauderdale running more than 14 inches below. They're actually on pace for their driest summer on record. And again, in the Caribbean, these are just remarkable. Arecibo, more than 14 inches below average for the season. Juncos, nearly 13 inches below normal. San Juan's running a deficit of about a foot. And really several locations across the Caribbean are experiencing their largest summer rainfall deficits on record. So, as we would expect, the rainfall pattern is certainly variable across the region. We would expect that this time of year. But in terms of the major feature that's really dominated, especially across Florida, the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean, it's been that persistent dryness. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see the impact that that's had on drought. Now, I mentioned some of those wet spots across the Southeast. There's actually been a bit of good news compared to where we were, just a few months ago. The map on the right there, that's the change map over the past 4 weeks. You see a lot of green on that map, which is good. That indicates improvement. We've seen widespread 1 to 2 category improvements across North Carolina, Virginia, even some 3 category improvements, as well as portions of South Carolina, some parts of Georgia, Florida, Tennessee. As I'm sure you all remember, earlier this summer, nearly the entire Southeast News region was experiencing drought, including some fairly widespread, severe, or even extreme drought. And as you can see, that's changed considerably. Moderate drought or worse now covers about 35% of the region, a little more than a third. Severe drought or worse is covering about 15%, and extreme drought is now down to about 4%. In fact, the coverage of moderate drought or worse is now the lowest value since we have to go back to last September, almost a year ago, when we had drought coverage this low. So that's good news. Severe drought coverage is at its lowest point since last October, and extreme drought is at its lowest coverage since the start of the year. Now, there are still some areas where drought's a concern, especially across parts of the Carolinas and Florida, although there may be some good news coming up. We'll talk about that in a second. And we've seen some recent deterioration along the northern Gulf Coast. We've seen some abnormal dryness and some moderate drought return there. But overall, if you look at the big picture, this is definitely an improvement from where we were late last spring and into the first part of this summer. Okay, next slide. So back to the Caribbean. Unfortunately, the story is just completely reversed when we look at the U.S. Caribbean. No surprise here. Droughts really expanded and intensified across certainly Puerto Rico, also the Virgin Islands. We're now seeing, at least in Puerto Rico, we're seeing extreme drought across almost 3/4 of the island. We're seeing drought, moderate drought or worse around across about 3/4 of the island. About 2/3 of the island is in severe drought or worse, and about 1/3 is experiencing extreme drought. And these are actually the greatest coverage values, if you will, that we've observed for each of these categories since the drought monitor began back in 2000. You see the extreme drought there on the Virgin Islands for St. Thomas and St. John. This is the first time we've seen D3 since October of 2023, so almost 3 years. And then for St. Croix, you got to go back to July of 2022, last time St. Croix saw D3 conditions. And, these aren't just numbers on a map, right? If you've been paying attention to the news, I mean, we're seeing significant impacts in the region. Puerto Rico has implemented rotating water rationing across parts of San Juan and some of the surrounding communities, with potentially up to 200,000 customers going without water for 48 hours at a time. So very significant impacts there. And just last week, the USDA issued a drought disaster declaration for all 3 of the U.S. Virgin Islands. So that's going to provide access to emergency assistance for farmers and producers, which is certainly good. But it's really becoming one of the more significant drought episodes that we've seen in recent decades, honestly, across the Caribbean. And it's certainly something we'll continue to monitor closely as we head through the fall. Okay, next slide. All right, shifting gears quickly to the outlook. So we'll start, as we usually do, with ENSO. This was highlighted last time, and we've been talking about this now for several months. The probabilities of this El Nino becoming very strong have increased quite a bit over the past few months. In fact, CPC now indicating a greater than 90% chance of a very strong event. But what's interesting is just this past month, they went so far as to say that during the October through December period, there's now almost a 70% chance that this event could exceed the strength of previous El Nino events going back to 1950. Now, we say this every month, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'll say it again. We need to emphasize that a strong El Nino doesn't automatically mean stronger impacts everywhere, right? What it does is it increases the likelihood of seeing some of the atmospheric patterns and climate impacts you typically associate with El Nino, right? And for us in the Southeast, for a good portion of the region, that means cooler and hopefully wetter than normal conditions. And that's really going to be important here as we head into fall and especially into winter, right? This ever important recharge season that we have, that's really going to be important. And certainly we see El Nino having its strongest impacts as we head into winter. So we'll see how that evolves here in the coming months. Okay, next slide. All right, so with all that in mind, we'll take a look here at the fall outlook. The seasonal outlook from CPC covers the next 3 months here through the end of November. Above average temperatures favored pretty much region wide, though there are some equal chances found across the interior of the region. Very, very, classic El Nino signature there. In terms of precipitation, we're beginning to see a somewhat wetter signal emerge. That's actually what I meant by the El Nino pattern, sorry. Seeing a somewhat wetter signal emerge across southern portions of the region, with above average rainfall favored from parts of Georgia and northern Florida into the Carolinas. This could certainly be beneficial for some of the areas that continue to experience drought, as we saw a few slides ago. We look further west, including much of Alabama and Tennessee, there really isn't a strong signal one way or the other. Okay, next slide. All right, looking in the Caribbean, again, the outlook is much less encouraging. The models continue to favor above average temperatures across the region through the fall. At the same time, below average precipitation is favored. And again, given the magnitude of those rainfall deficits that we looked at a few slides ago, along with the record drought coverage across Puerto Rico, that's obviously a concern. This is also important. This is an important time climatologically, because September and October are typically among the wettest months of the year across the Caribbean. Tropical activity has a lot to do with that, of course. But, if we continue to see a lack of activity and below average rainfall during this period, that would certainly make any meaningful drought recovery much more difficult as we head into the winter months. Okay, next slide. All right, so we can see all that reflected in the latest seasonal drought outlook. Conditions generally expected to continue improving across a good portion of the mainland Southeast through the end of November, with some drought removal likely, again, across many of those sort of drought-affected areas that we've been talking about along the Atlantic coast, Georgia, Carolinas, parts of Florida. All that lines up fairly well with that kind of wetter signal that we saw previously. But unfortunately, as we said, in the Caribbean, we expect, given the outlook and current conditions, we expect drought to persist across much of the region, maybe some additional development filling in the rest of Puerto Rico there. So that's what we see there in terms of drought. Okay, next slide. Real quickly, before we move into the shorter term outlooks, I just wanted to provide a quick update on the Atlantic hurricane season. As you know, NOAA updates their outlook each August. So just recently they updated this, and no surprise, they continue to favor a below normal season. There's now a 75% chance of below normal activity. Updated forecast calls for 7 to 13 named storms. We've had 3 so far, including 2 to 6 hurricanes. Haven't had any yet, and as many as 2 major hurricanes. The strengthening El Nino, as we discussed a little while ago, that's an important part of the outlook. Since El Nino tends to increase wind shear and suppresses tropical cyclone development. But as we always emphasize, a below normal season doesn't mean there's no risk, right? We're now entering the climatological peak of hurricane season. In fact, there's a area of activity across the main development region that NHC is currently looking at, actually. So we'll see how that evolves. But again, as we know, it only takes one storm affecting our region to produce significant impacts and make for a memorable season. So definitely need to keep that in mind, despite the outlook. Okay, next slide. We'll finish here real quickly with the short-term outlooks. 6 to 10-day period as we kind of wrap up August, move into September. Above average temperatures favored across basically the entire region. Strongest probabilities to the south. In terms of rainfall, more or less near normal amounts favored across most of the region, except maybe parts of the Carolinas and Virginia. If we go to the next slide, take us into the first full week of September. Again, continuation of above average temperatures, and in terms of precipitation, near normal conditions are favored as we start the new month. And then finally, on the next slide, last slide here, as we head into the middle of September, above average temperatures favored. Again, sounds like a broken record, but consistent with the forecast here. Rainfall forecast, again, less certain, equal chances across basically the entire southeast. So again, no strong indication that we're heading into a wetter or drier pattern here in the short term. So so in the short term, odds kind of remain tilted towards, again, continued warmth as we transition from summer into fall with less certainty in terms of the rainfall. And so the summary slide should be next. There it is. You can look at that after the webinar. Again, want to thank William Schmitz for all his work every month in helping put this webinar together. And I'll turn it over to Shelby now for our water resources update.
Thanks, Chris. And we can go ahead and go to my first information slide. So over the past month, we have seen more stream reaches in normal conditions than we had in July. Over half the streams are normal, with majority of the much and extremely below normal being confined to Florida. Tennessee is the only state where streams are widespread much above normal. And although rainfall has been close to normal across the southeast, the dry antecedent conditions are still evident where we see in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama still spotty below normal stream flows. We can go to the next slide. So getting into our duration hydrographs, these are provisional since the decommissioning of Water Watch by the USGS and created in-house now at the Southeast River Forecast Center. And so we'll get started with Tennessee, where runoff has been normal since June and actually peaked in the 76th percentile during the month of July. Exiting August, this is now indicating maybe a decrease in the runoff back into normal conditions. And although much of the state was near normal, it was only on that eastern portion where rainfall was above normal. And so when we put the entire state together for this graphic, we have some of this downward trend in runoff. In Alabama, we saw a sharp increase to the 90th percentile of runoff back in the beginning of June, thanks to some tropical rainfall. But runoff has since declined to normal conditions and continues to indicate a decline as rainfall was somewhere between 1 and 4 inches below normal, and the temperatures have been above normal in the past month. We'll have to keep an eye for if there are any moisture systems that kind of linger or move into the area that are maybe enough to sustain the normal conditions. If not, we may start to see the state average runoff head back into below normal conditions. On the next slide, we have Georgia and Florida. And so in Georgia, runoff has not reached above normal this year. The overall trend is still similar to Alabama. Normal conditions are present, and again, we'll have to just kind of monitor to see how much the runoff could possibly decline, or if we remain in this normal state for the next few months. In Florida, there along the Gulf side of the peninsula, and so that contributed to the runoff not falling further into the much below normal, and we're starting to see a trend into just below normal across the state. But we still don't have the normal flows that we typically associate with the rainfall season there. And so we can go to the next slide. In South Carolina, runoff remains below normal, but it has been steady since the early part of the month. The rainfall across the state has been very location dependent, but near normal. But this, in addition to the warm summer temperatures, have just kind of assisted in moving from the much below normal to only below normal and remaining steady. In North Carolina, there have been some really significant recent improvements. The bound to normal runoff during the month marks the first time that the state has streams that have been normal since August of last year. Though more recently the runoff trend is downward, the rainfall forecast for at least the next for the state. Lastly, we'll take a look at Virginia, where runoff is steady in the normal and trending still positive and maybe towards much above normal. We can go to the following slide. So we have had some localized heavy rainfall that was able to produce very isolated action stage rises in the last month, but in general, conditions across the southeast have and are currently below normal flood conditions, or below flood conditions. Sorry. To the next slide and look at our typical flood climatology for the southeast. And so across the entire southeast in week 35, we're starting to usually trend into a peak in our floods, and so this is related to the peak of the tropical season. So far, as Chris has said, development has been suppressed, but that does not mean we will not see a storm in the coming weeks that could put us close to climatology and some potential flooding. But for now, we do remain below normal in terms of flood climatology across the east. On the next slide, we take a look at Florida, where it is typically the rainy season, and minor floods are very typical of the time. And we're actually at a time where the moderate and major floods tend to start to increase. Again, this is heavily tied to tropical moisture, and so we're yet to see that across the state. And as we saw earlier, a lot of the streams are still much below normal. But again, as the entire southeast, also in Florida, it could only take one event. And so we'll go to the following slide. And the story here for our risk for flooding is very similar to what I said in our climatology. We are below normal across much of the coastal Carolinas and Virginia and Florida, but we have some near normal or normal risk for flooding across parts of Appalachia, Georgia, and Alabama. And so this is due to being in near normal conditions in that area versus still having some drought and low streams along our coastal areas. The September through November period does overlap with the peak of tropical season and when we may start to see some of the El Nino features present that self over the southeast. And so even these areas where we have a below normal risk, that story could quickly change to normal risk if we are to see some stalled frontal systems or even tropical moisture move over the area. And so the following slide is my summary, and you can view that as you please. And so now I will hand it off to our guest speaker or no, I am handing it off to Pam Knox, who is back for agriculture.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Shelby. It's good to be back. If you are wondering where I've been the last 2 months, is I retired on June 1, and then the University of Georgia rehired me in July to work through my position part-time and maintain the grants and so on while they go through the hiring process. And it looks like I will probably be around for at least a few more months as they go through that whole process. And so I am back. And so we're going to talk a little bit about agricultural impacts, and we're going to look ahead because, of course, we're almost in fall, meteorologically speaking. So some of the impacts that we've seen on recent conditions in agriculture, the frequent showers that we've had and the high humidities we've had have led to really an explosion of fungal diseases in cotton, peanuts, corn, and other crops. I think Bob Kemmerate of UGA has said that it's a party every night in the fields because it is so moist that the fungal diseases are just going crazy. Early planted corn is, of course, past black layer, so it's not really affected by that anymore. But if you have late planted corn, it is still vulnerable. And so that is something that you need to watch carefully, or if that's second crop corn. Chris pointed out the sporadic nature of rain. We've had a lot of rain in some places, and other places have been missed time after time by these showers. And that's one of the things about summertime rainfall. The drought monitor isn't really capable of handling all that really high variation rainfall. And so some of you may be a little frustrated by that if you're in one of the dry areas. The dry spots have been impacting crops and pastures. I've noticed that the condition monitoring reports are still having some people report severely dry conditions in some places. Those are the places that have been missed by all those rain showers that we've had. We do know that cotton and peanuts, big commodity crops, of course, here in the Southeast, are still developing, but they have disease pressure. And in some cases, the pressure is so bad that the yields are just really kind of sad. And so that's going to be an issue for some farmers, I think. We're near the end of the peach harvest. I saw in South Carolina the last few peaches are now really starting to enter the market, and that should be the end of that soon. We're starting to enter the fall muscadine season. So we're in the process of transferring from early summer crops to the late summer and early fall crops across our diseases. Fall vegetables are being planted in many places, and strawberry fields are being prepared for later planting in South Carolina, probably also in Florida and Georgia. And fruit trees in the hot, dry areas are really being hit hard by whiteflies. And so if you're treating for those, you need to make sure to look at the weather forecast to make sure you get the timing right with the rain that's expected or not expected to occur. So all of those things are happening right now in agriculture. Farmers are working like crazy to keep everything going and looking forward to that harvest, which really isn't that far from now if you look at the calendar. So let's go on to the next slide. And you can see here the soil temperature and moisture. Soil temperature, of course, we've had all this hot weather across the whole region, so it's not surprising that the soil temperature is warmer than normal. Of course, they're having a lot of evaporation issues from that. If you have rain, then it gets really buggy, but if you haven't had rain, then that can really put some stress on the plants. Soil moisture has been quite variable with the variable amounts of rainfall. See, it's been pretty dry in Florida. That's consistent with the drought there. Other parts of the region, I say the coastal plains probably in general have been drier than places that are more upstate in Alabama and Georgia and western North Carolina and Virginia as well. So it's consistent with the rainfall that Chris showed and the temperature that Chris showed in his slides earlier. If we go on, It might seem a little early to talk about the first freeze, but we're starting to look ahead and looking at that. The biggest concern for this for agriculture is the crops that were planted late. We had a pretty wet spring. A lot of people could not get into the fields very early. So there's some crops that still need some time in the ground. And, they're, I'm sure, a little worried because last year, the first fall frost or freeze occurred for most of the region occurred in mid-November, which was relatively early. And that was, I think, a concern for a lot of farmers. It's certainly a concern for those who have late planted crops this year. If the conditions stay dry, in some areas the freeze could be more likely just because overnight temperatures can drop more. If it's really humid, it's really hard to get those temperatures to go down. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's definitely a local condition. If you have a farm or a field that's in a low-lying area, of course, that's also going to be more affected because the coldest air always sinks down to the lowest levels. And one thing we also need to keep in mind, if we have cool and wet El Nino conditions occurring relatively early in the winter, say late October even, that could keep freezing conditions away just because we'll have a lot of moisture, we'll have a lot of clouds. But we don't know that yet, so that's something we're going to be watching. If we go on, agricultural impacts of a very strong El Nino. If you follow social media at all, this is Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky or any of the other ones. I think TikTok also. They have just been nuts talking about the super El Nino. Super El Nino is not a scientific term. We call them very strong El Ninos, and it's just related to the ocean temperature in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. We are in an El Nino now, as Chris pointed out. It's strong now, it's getting stronger. So it probably will peak sometime around December, which is pretty typical. And that is definitely going to affect our weather this winter. Now, one of the things we have to keep in mind is just because it's a really strong El Nino doesn't mean that ag impacts are necessarily going to be stronger. It's just we have more confidence that the impacts that we expect to see from an El Nino will happen. And so all these stories about, doomsday predictions about how things are going to happen that have never happened before are really just for clicks. They're really not necessarily something that's going to happen. Could the impacts be strong? Sure, they could be in some places, but it's not going to be a doomsday scenario. We do know that the El Nino is already affecting us by the number of, or the lack of tropical systems that we've had this year. Last year, we didn't have any tropical, at least any hurricanes that came through the southeast. We did have one tropical storm that went through the Carolinas. That really contributed to the dry conditions we had last fall. So if we have dry conditions again this early fall, we could go back a little bit, at least for a while, to some more droughty conditions. But as soon as that winter El Nino pattern comes in, we're going to start to see a lot more rain, a lot more clouds in some places. El Nino usually works along a band that's associated with the subtropical jet. And underneath that is where the storms move through. They bring in all this rain and cooler temperatures just because it's cloudy, not necessarily because the temperatures are coming from the Arctic. So if you are worried about harvest this fall, you are going to really have to watch the forecast for timing of rain and when to happen. This is not a year to just leave your crops out in the field for weeks and hope they're going to be okay, because if the rain comes in, we could go to a pretty wet condition quickly. So that's something to keep in mind. We do know that El Nino winds are typically colder than normal. Mostly that's due to the clouds and rain, not necessarily cold outbreaks. Although it's winter, so there's certainly going to be some. And that is something we'll have to keep in mind. People have asked about snow. Well, snow, yeah, we could see some snow. Snow only occurs, though, if you have a really good combination of the really cold air plus a lot of moisture. And those don't always match up. And so we'll probably see some snow. Will it be worse than usual? It could be, but probably not everywhere and not necessarily a lot of it. We also know that as far as spring goes, and fruit farmers worried about late frost, there's really no statistical relationship between El Nino and a late frost. There's about the same number of late frosts that occur in La Nina springs as in El Nino springs. The ones you really have to worry about are neutral conditions. And I don't think we're going to be in neutral conditions by spring this year, because this is a really strong El Nino. It will take a while to get out of it. So wet and cold conditions in the spring could delay planting. That's something to keep in mind. You might not be able to get field work done early in the spring. Also could be cloudy, so that crops could be relatively slow to establish. One good piece of news is that typically when we have an El Nino, we don't have a spring drought. Sometimes not even a summer drought, because we have all that residual moisture that is available for the plants even if we go through a dry spell. So I want to make sure to get that in, because farmers are thinking ahead and they need to figure out what are they going to be expecting in the next few months. So if we go on, this is my summary, and I'm just going to let you read it later. And I am delighted to turn it over to our special guest, Michael Gavazzi, who's going to talk about drought. And when I retired in June, we know we're just starting to come out of drought in the Southeast. It had been a very bad spring, but I was happy to see that we're coming out of that. But there's going to be another drought, and Michael's going to tell us what to do about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Great to be following up after you again. Good morning, everyone. Today, as Pam said, I'll be talking and sharing information about drought preparation management and recovery guides that we've co-produced with extension agents and other subject matter experts in the Southeast. Next slide, please. First, I want to acknowledge some of the people that have helped. This has been a multi-year effort, and a lot of individuals have helped get it to this point, especially Meredith Muth, who's really was with us in the beginning, helped kind of support us and get this process moving, connecting us with folks in the region to help move along. And Elliot, thanks for picking up after Meredith left. Also at the National Drought Mitigation Center, Tanya High and Grace Campbell were really instrumental in helping us put together some of the drought monitoring and drought tracking resources I'll talk about. The state climate offices that we were in contact with and had them review some of our information just to make sure we were getting the most relevant, up-to-date information. And as you know, a lot of this changes. It was an interesting process as new resources came online and others have disappeared. Thanks to technical editor Cynthia Moser, who's just been fantastic. She's done a lot of USDA work. If you have a chance to work with her, I recommend it. The many reviewers, 30+ reviewers that have, mostly extension agents that have reviewed the work of the authors, also extension agents, but different people, and probably about 30 authors that have contributed to this effort. Next slide, please. The motivation or the impetus for this project came from these Midwest decision calendars that we learned about. It looked like a really simple way to put information in a little circle that you could turn per month, and it would line up with your, the phenology of your plant, looking at some of your management decisions, what are your outcomes, what are your drought concerns, and what kind of outcomes you can observe. It seemed like a simple way to get the information across. Well, we tried to apply it to corn. We met with extension agents and a few farmers, and we started collecting information. We realized there was just too much information to put inside of a simple wheel like these specialty crops did. So we pivoted a little bit. Next slide, please. We pivoted and we followed a format that we used when we developed our hurricane and recovery guides. And it starts with building resilience. And that's the first section of each. And it's like, what are the systems you can put in place to reduce your risk and build resilience to drought? And then the next section, we'll talk about adaptive actions. What do you do when you're in a drought? A lot of it's following up on hopefully systems and plans that you already have in place. And then into drought recovery, whether when a disaster designation has been declared or the drought is over, it's rained, what do you do then? And then after section 3, after the drought recovery, we encourage people to go back to the building a resilience section and employing some lessons learned from the drought that they can incorporate into their drought plan and managements next year. And then several appendices that I'll talk about as well. Next slide, please. First section I'll talk about is this building resilient. These are practices that can be adopted well before a drought occurs. That's important to remember to maintain productivity, reduce risk, and reduce recovery time once the drought has occurred. After the drought, I said incorporate the lessons learned. Next slide, please. The building resilience, it starts with developing a drought plan. We emphasize that throughout the guide, the importance of having a drought plan. We have an appendix that kind of walks through a sample drought plan. Surprised how little information there was when we first started putting this together. Maybe that's changed, but there wasn't a lot out there for farmers to build off of So we hope this helps kind of start a conversation, make sure they think about things that they may not have thought about already. Emphasize working with technical service providers. This is your NRCS field staff, university extension, veterinarians, etc. Matching varieties if you're growing crops, based selection on the seasonal weather forecasts, and then taking advantage of USDA programs such as through NRCS, FSA, and give some examples here, just a few expanding wells in anticipation of droughts. Next slide, please. Another part is we focus on is managing heat stress. This is not just in livestock, but with people as well. So we start out each section with an emphasis on worker safety. We provide a few tools that are out there. One recent one, I'm not sure if this was talked about on one of these monthly calls. If not, it may be a good topic. And that's this North Carolina State Climate Office Extreme Heat Dashboard. And what this does, it really emphasizes the use of a wet bulb globe temperature, which is a little more comprehensive than using heat index. And it can be used by outdoor workers and their managers to improve heat safety. Next slide, please. When we get into drought planning and monitoring, we did this in collaboration with the National Drought Mitigation Center, as well as some of the state climate offices in the region. It emphasizes what we feel and hope is the most up-to-date resources where they can get information to help them reduce their risk, track short-term and long-term drought risk, and make decisions based on those forecasts. Emphasizing USDA and NOAA programs, Drought Monitor, Drought Gov, things hopefully all are familiar with. Long-term planning, getting into the CPC and their drought information. And then short-term planning as well, where you're looking at National Weather Service, Drought Gov outlooks and forecasts. We talk a little bit about flash drought. Didn't really have anything specific for producers to consider with the flash drought or change. It's just more of an awareness. There are a few tools available from states that line up, like Drought Watch, that kind of we refer them to, but just more of an awareness, letting them know about flash drought, since it seems to be kind of a new concept as well, as even though I know we've been talking about it here for a while. Next slide, please. So it gives examples of different resources they can use. This is a nice one. It talks about whether there's met stations near their farm. They can potentially line up with those stations, at least get a feeling of how their on-site measurements are lining up with the closest met station, and hopefully there's agreement they can use some of the additional information from that met station in their planning. Next slide, please. So this was the kind of what we first started to develop when we were talking about a decision calendar, and this is from our forage guide, and it's kind of a way to get the farmers to start thinking about what are the impacts, depending for forage, during the growing season, think what are some of the impacts you're going to see: delayed fertilizer, reduced effectiveness of herbicides potentially, and then goes down into the management actions that they should be taking, measuring their forage, reducing stocking rate, considering things that they may need to do as drought develops. And then in the bottom row has decision-making resources. Some of these, there's links to these actual resources here. They're just mentioned, whether they should be looking at the short-term forecast, some El Nino forecasts as well, short-term, long-term impacts. Next slide, please. And for our improving soil health, drought resilience, and recovery, we focus on some programs through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and Farm Service agencies. Some of these are available year-round, such as EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the Conservation Stewardship Program. Others, some of the FSA ones, may be only available with a disaster designation. So you need to get familiar with those programs. It's good to know before the season what programs may be applicable, and have information, make some contacts to get information about it. A lot of this is communications. We stress, talking with people, not now, but before the drought, so that when the drought comes or it starts to intensify, you have that communication, you have someone you've been speaking with, and it just helps the engagement be more productive. Next slide, please. For crops, each section has a crop or livestock concerns section. This is oftentimes you can connect to some really nice regional resources like the Southeast U.S. Vegetable Crop Handbook, which has everything you need to know about managing these crops. Some of them are a little light on drought, so hopefully we fill that gap. But oftentimes what we'll do is we'll give a little information about a concern or a management option, and then we'll have a resource where they can learn more, who they should talk to. And most of the times that's their local extension agent, veterinarian, or NRCS conservation agent. The poultry environmental guides, and some states have their own guides. A lot of time we spend kind of just canvassing the internet and extension websites and finding what's out there. We don't want to overwhelm the readers with information, but we want to make them aware of options they have and who they should talk to, and then letting them know how to do that. We talk about water requirements. It's going to vary by growth stage, at planting, germination, etc. Animal health and nutrition. What are shade requirements? Things to think about. How are you going to get water out to your fields if they're needed? Variety selection, variety considerations are important. Often you can get these trials through university extension. The trick there is, if they did the 2025 trials, hopefully the website for 2026 is the same if we publish this early. It's hard, finding a site that stays dynamic each year so that people can find these resources. And then, planting dates, maybe to consider planning, spreading out planting dates based on the forecast, looking at late maturing or early maturing varieties or options as well. Thinking about pest complexes that can change under drought. One example, we have spider mites. They generally reproduce better in stressed crops, but it's less likely to be controlled by naturally occurring fungus that can keep them in check when it's wet and humid. Next slide, please. Section on water management. This is where it's important for them to assess their resources versus their needs. Do they need to drill more wells? Maybe potentially add more water storage tanks? Thinking about water troughs and feed troughs for livestock. Irrigation, considering the timing, the amounts, maintenance. That's a big one. Talks about getting these things done before a drought, having your systems ready to go. If you're doing poultry, making sure your cooling systems are ready to go to turn on when you need them, not having to do that in the middle of a drought. We talk about some well water considerations, maybe water quality testing if relevant, stormwater capture, and dry land considerations, water metering if needed. For dry lands, it's not recommended, but some folks still do that. So there's information about that for those producers as well. And one of the things we do throughout the guide, you see on the right, is just the list of resources that we could find. So this one is, we're talking about irrigation. So if a university or non-university, sometimes we definitely try to promote the USDA program. SARE has some great ones, but the universities really have, when they're available, they're the most relevant to the producers in those states. But they can also see what other states have as well if they're interested in learning more. Next slide, please. For infrastructure, this mostly goes to the livestock producers. I'm looking at my time. Trees and windbreaks are important for both livestock as well as crops. Maybe there's silvopasture for poultry and beef operations, giving them information about how they could use that to reduce their risk. And poultry house management, whether it's a ventilation, cool cell systems, there's a little bit about that. Again, they can always find resources to learn more that we give them. Next slide, please. Record keeping, documentation, insurance. This is a big one, pre and post drought documentation. I think we can't stress that enough. We always say the importance of pre and drought, post drought documentation cannot be overstated. Looking at soil moisture, keeping track of this. When did you start to see wilting? If you have on-farm measurements of soil moisture, temperature, that could be really useful for tracking when different phenological changes are impacted by water stress or temperature stress. Developing your own maps is recommended, just so you know which soils may have different wilting points. Recommend using drones to capture pre and post conditions. Considering all of your insurance options, of course, reviewing your policy regularly, and contributing to CMOR. That's talked about on here a lot. We stress throughout the guide, contributing to CMOR outside of the drought. Just you need to have that information, what's going on when it's wet, and it really helps help document conditions and see the changes over time. Next slide, please. The second section, we start talking about adaptive actions during a drought, implementing these measures that you already have in place or are ready to be put in place as the drought conditions develop and persist. As prolonged drought periods of reduced precipitation continue, you're going to see the negative impacts, and adaptive actions can help mitigate these negative impacts. Again, we start here with personal health and well-being, federal and state resources. Very stressful to be at a drought if you're a farmer. So we start to talk about some of the resources that are available, and we've seen a lot crop up in just about every state where they have some really timely and useful information to help with stress management. Reviewing your drought pasture plan. If you have something with NRCS, this is what you want to do with them. And then adjust as appropriate. And we have some decision tables in the appendix I'll talk about that can kind of talks about what they need to be thinking about during different seasons, as well as where to get the resources to help them make those decisions. Continue your drought monitoring, short-term, long-term as well. Short-term is really important here. Crop and livestock considerations. This is where assessing your water and shade requirements. Are you meeting those demands? Monitoring for pests and diseases that can sometimes be a complex during drought. It can be difficult, like I talked about, the combination of drought and stress. Shade, trough placement in the fields. You need to be thinking about animal mortality disposal. I didn't mention that in the building a resilient operation. I might have passed over, but that's important. It's something you need to be thinking about before the drought, and then as drought continues, if you have livestock, unfortunately, you may have to consider what you do with animal mortality, and you check your plan, make sure it's up to date, all your contacts are there. A common statement in most of the guides, wilting is almost always associated with yield penalties. That's obviously for the crops, not the livestock as much, although they certainly have their issues with drought. Next slide, please. We talk about saltwater intrusion considerations because we've seen, especially in Mississippi the last few years, there's been some issues with saltwater getting further inland into aquifers, up waterways. There's a lot of rivers and ditches. Eastern North Carolina has a lot of ditches that brings that saltwater in. And it can occur and get worse during drought. And you're pulling salty water out of the aquifer. Harvesting considerations. This is maybe a little for dryland farmers. They may need to decide to harvest or to terminate crop and take the insurance payment. It's tough decisions they have to make. Fire hazards are certainly a concern with combines, with dry weather. Soil considerations, looking at your fertility and moisture. How are you going to apply fertilizers if you're not getting the moisture you need? The timing, obviously if you have some irrigation, you can help with this, as well as water management, looking at irrigation. You want to stay ahead of wilting. Stormwater capture as well. If you have wells, you may need to run, or if you have a pond, you may need to recharge your pond from wells. Next slide, please. Some more adaptive actions, record keeping here. It's really important during the drought to keep track of the changes you're seeing, implementing drones, continuing to contribute to Seymour. This is kind of the time where most people are doing it, but it's important here. We want you to do it year round. Responding to crop failure. What are you going to do? Are you going to terminate your crop, desiccate and burn down weeds? Hopefully these are the things that would be in your drought plan, so that when you're faced with these unfortunate situations, you've thought about what you can do and what you need to do. Disaster assistance programs that are available. So like I said before, some of them require a drought declaration to be declared. So you want to know, be familiar with those. We talk about long-term drought considerations as well, some earlier disease concerns the following year, that if the drought continues, possible water restrictions depending on where you are, how your area is zoned. And this is a drought that exceeds one or more seasons. Persistent exceeds for beyond one growing season. Next slide, please. Last section, drought recovery. This is post-drought. Once a disaster designation is declared or the drought conditions are no longer negatively impacting your crops. So the drought is essentially over, is what that's saying. Next slide, please. And again, we can start here with personal health and well-being, which is really important, especially now that you've gotten through the drought one way or another. Your communications that you have established, this is where they really pay off with your extension, your FSA, risk management agency, and others. Water resources, we talked about, continue recharging ponds. Hopefully there's a wet fall that kind of takes care of this for you, but something you need to monitor. Record keeping, documentation, insurance, keeping notes, taking videos and photos, using your drones, estimating losses. There's information about that for each commodity. Again, contributing to Seymour, and then disaster resistance programs that we talked about a little bit. Next slide, please. In the appendix, we have 5 appendices. The first one kind of gives what we're calling our drought plan template. It's mostly considerations that each producer should think about depending on their commodity. Getting just basic information, getting you thinking about what are my soil types, where do I have wilting, where are my grazing pastures that wilt quicker, how am I going to plan for a drought, bringing in supplemental feed if I need to. It's a loosely formed template, but it gets you thinking about some of the considerations that you'll need to have and address. And I'm going to move a little quicker since time's getting short. Next slide, please. And these are our decision tables, or a sample of our decision tables. Then this is kind of the meat of what would have gone into the calendar, the decision calendar, the round decision calendar if we had done that. And if there's crops, we based it on season, 4 seasons. If it's livestock, it's often based on the growth stage that they're in, whether it's a breeding cow, a calf, a heifer, depending, it'll have different considerations in how you'd handle it during a drought. For the crops, we have something like this. It's variety selection is a popular one that we mentioned briefly. Later maturing varieties versus early maturing varieties. That's the impact. Those are the decisions you're needing to make. And in the drought information needs, you need to know the current status of the drought, your short-term, long-term forecasts. And then over on the right, you have your links to find that information to help you with your planning and decision making. Next slide, please. Appendix 3 is just a contacts list to have ready. It mentions, let you look at that. Your contractors, insurance companies, maybe some emergency services. It's going to be different everywhere you are, depending on some states might not have an emergency management agency. Just use what you have, and always being in touch with your extension is always a good place to start. Next slide, please. Our initial site planning, I'll just go over quickly. And these are just, the site characteristics to consider to help you better prepare to adapt to drought conditions in the future. Thinking about some of the water limitations, what's the quality and quantity concerns you have? Does the land fall within city or zoning limits that may restrict your regulations? If I didn't say this already, this is when you're looking at leasing or buying new land for your operation, assessing water supply and electrical grid. Next slide, please. And last appendix is kind of our landing spot for all of the resources. So we break it down by each state. We try to find the extension websites you hear for soybeans. Most extension sites have a page dedicated to soybeans, as well as who to contact. Some of the state resources that they want to reach out to. Next slide, please. And then we have NRCS contacts for states, as well as FSA contacts for each state, which is a really important resource for you. Next slide, please. And the last appendix is our federal resources. It's a combination, a lot of USDA, NOAA, Department of the Interior. We have our Drought Govs on here. And it's probably about 2 pages of resources that are mentioned in the guide, just to put them all in one place at the end of the guide. All right, next slide, please. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so the guide status, where are we now? It's been several years. I don't even want to think about how many it's taking to get to this point, but we're starting to get the guides published. We have a forage and a soybean guide that just came out last month. We hope to have the beef guide, should be out in December. It probably won't get done this month. It'll be early September, sorry. The rest of the guides, we have 6 or 7 that are in final review. Unfortunately, those phases take a little while. That means they've gotten past an extension review of it, but we did get some internal reviews and get the mock-up going. So we're hoping we can get all these out this fall, and then producers can start to use them and start to prepare for next year if there's any droughts. Next slide, please. And one follow-up we're going to do with our partners at the North Carolina State Climate Office is we're going to be hosting workshops that are going to targeting toward extension agents, NRCS agents as well, who want to get experience facilitating their own workshops. So it's kind of a train the trainer opportunity where we're going to go through the guides. We're going to give them experience developing a drought plan and how to talk to producers and get feedback from them, so that they can go on and have their own workshops in their own communities with on their own. Next slide, please. And that is all with a minute to spare. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all our presenters today. I appreciate them taking their time and giving us all this wonderful information, especially Michael giving us an update on the released and forthcoming producer guides. We will be working with him at NITIS to keep you all updated with the release of those guides as they come out. I'm not seeing any questions in the Slido app. And since we're at the top of the hour, I will just say if you have any questions regarding the information that was provided today, please just reach out to me at elliot.wickham@noaa.gov, and I'd be happy to either help answer those questions or put you in touch with the right person. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, and we will see you on our next webinar, September 22nd. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.